Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about album number 9 from Tangerine Dream, Force Majeure. Okay, it's 1979, we came off the heels of a weird one-off detour with Cyclone that ended up not going over the best with fans at the time, although it does seem to be more fondly remembered by today's standards, going by the comments I got on that last video. After that album's mixed reception, the band ended up dropping their one-off vocalist Steve Jolliffe and carrying on as the trio of Thru, Franke, and Klaus Krieger, although the latter would leave the band himself right after this project. Now, on a personal level, I'm gonna be honest, I feel like I missed out on this one. When I first went through the earlier Tangerine Dream catalog when I was in high school, there were a number of projects I was picking up and really getting into from the eras both immediately preceding this album and immediately coming after this album, but I barely had any memory of hearing Force Majeure. I'm fairly certain I listened to it at least once in high school, but I couldn't remember anything about it. I remembered Cyclone really well from when I was that age, and obviously have an even stronger connection to the two albums they came out with after this one. But this particular album appears to have fallen through the cracks for me for whatever reason. Which feels really weird to me now, because when I came back to revisit it for this video, I was like, whoa, this is great. How did I not remember this? This feels like it would have absolutely been my shit in high school. Cyclone may have shown the band going in their most overtly prog-centric direction yet, and this album very much doubles down on that prog influence with just as much regular guitars and drumming, if not even more than last time. Though it's not nearly executed in such an unflattering way as it was last time, where Cyclone could occasionally make them come off as a cheaper version of their influences, Force Majeure combines the prog rock and synth elements in a much more seamless manner that reminds you that this band was very much the real deal on the prog scene as well. Where the last album gave me some really strong Pink Floyd vibes, this one gives me similar vibes to a band like Yes. There's a lot more of an easily accessible and energetic and epic approach to all the compositions here that kinda has a similar energy to tracks of theirs like Yours Is No Disgrace and South Side of the Sky and all those, but the influence is never so blatant that it prevents these tracks from still feeling like Tangerine Dream first and foremost. These are still obviously electronic epics that have a rock flavor without entirely dipping into just regular old rock music. Madrigal Meridian from the previous album may have hinted at the direction they'd go in here, but this whole album takes that track's approach and does it way better. Makes it feel complete and not feel like a novelty or experiment anymore. Also with much stronger and full-sounding production to boot. Easily their most full-sounding record yet. Which may be a mixed blessing for fans of their sparser material, I suppose, but still. This album does sound really freaking good. Right from when this album starts with the 18-minute title track, I got completely floored right off the bat. It starts off with a few minutes of well-layered but spooky and strange experimental synth effects that come together in an odd abstract sea of ambience that mostly avoids melodies. Though some flute-like melodies start to take form after the 2-minute mark over a set of choir-like synth pads and form some other dramatic ambience that has a very slight fake orchestral flavor, until a little before the 4-minute mark when all that falls away for some deep and round bass lines and some big epic keyboard chords, building up next to some big one-note guitar licks and propulsive drumming that adds up a little bit to like an Alan Parsons Project-esque mix. The drums take on a little bit of a disco-y flavor at some points too, and then there's some of that yes-ish acoustic guitar strumming for a little bit right at the 5.5-minute mark, and paying off into all these mixes of other electric guitars and keyboards and whatnot that are just so instantly hype-inducing. But if you thought maybe you weren't getting enough synths in that part, right around the 7-minute mark, there's a new change-up. There's a lot more acoustic guitar strumming going up next to their trademark synth arpeggios and soaring lead melodies to come in on top of them. And there's also all these ascending synth riffs that are made to resemble Hammond organs and really give me that Yours Is No Disgrace type energy. Next, after an ambient bridge featuring more formless experimental effects and a bunch of train sound effects in the middle, the next section starts to take form around the 10.5-minute mark as all these Pink Floyd-y guitar solos slowly fade in over all the formless seas of effects. Then after a church bell rings, we get a bunch of other layers of high-pitched ambient synths and arpeggios floating in and out for another few minutes, until more present melodies and chords really start to come in around the 14-minute mark that have a little bit of a, I guess, faux medieval flavor in that old prog tradition, I suppose. And then, finally, a little before the 16-minute mark, we finally get back to the more epic territory from before with more new dramatic melodies and chord progressions coming in with a little bit of a techno kick driving underneath all of it, and some kind of playful and goofy classical-inspired cadences thrown in for good measure, before finally culminating in one last dramatic ambient pad at the very end. Fuck, this entire track is so freaking great. I might even go as far as to say this is my favorite individual Tangerine Dream track they'd put out up to this point. Maybe that's just the prog lover in me, but man, did this go so hard and keep introducing so many new interesting ideas that were all hype-inducing in their own separate ways. The other two tracks on here didn't knock my socks off nearly as much as that title track did, but they're also no slouches either. Cloudburst Flight takes a bit of a comparatively more laid-back turn. Starts off with Edgar Fruza playing some acoustic guitar over some ambient pads. It gives me a little bit of the same vibes as like the opening moments of Yes's And You and I. Though obviously building into more of its own thing as some synth arpeggios start to fade in and some other melodies are introduced. Got more of the slow prog rock drumming and epic guitar soloing coming in later with some really big blaring leads in other parts. Again, pretty epic, although I'd say the two surrounding tracks are able to hit even greater heights. It definitely feels more like a bridge between two bigger pieces than a big climactic moment in its own right, at least to me. Now, while the title track may have run away with the honor of my favorite track on this thing, I think the biggest fan favorite might be the album's closer, Thru Metamorphic Rocks. I've gotten a handful of comments on my previous DD videos from people actively excited to hear me mention this track in particular. I feel like this one will do well for those who maybe wanted a more epic and intense, rock-flavored companion to the first side of Rubicon. Like, it starts out near silent with nothing but a couple of sparse piano chords, but builds up some drumming and synth string stabs. At first it focuses on this descending chord progression that feels really tense and suspenseful, but around the 2-minute mark switches over to a new, much more triumphant sounding chord progression that has a real sense of warmer finality to it, with more guitar solos to join in on top of it. Kick ass once again, and the first 4.5 minutes of this track could have theoretically just worked as an album closer all on its own. Really hits an effective emotional high point. Although then, the entire mix is deconstructed into another abstract sea of electronic effects before switching into an entirely new passage that ends up taking up the remaining 10 minutes of the entire track. It fades in all this clattering synth percussion and other bassy arpeggios, with these fuzzy and distorted bass synth stabs coming in as well that sort of resemble guitar riffs. I'm told that the distortion on those bass stabs was caused by a burnt-out transistor and they just ran with it because it sounded cool. Citation needed as to whether that's actually true, but it would track with their history of running with technical difficulties. And this section just keeps building and building and getting more dramatic and intense as it goes along for the entire rest of the track, before kind of fading into one last ambient pad right at the end. It's structured a lot like the sequencer-driven jam sessions that typified earlier albums of theirs, but it's one that has, I guess, more edge and bite to it. Obviously a lot more excitement-inducing compared to the likes of Rubicon, which would serve better as something to relax to, but I can definitely see why this would still appeal to the sects of their fanbase that aren't as big a fan of their more structured and accessibly melodic work that would follow from this point afterwards. But yeah, that's everything on Force Majeure. This project is great. It's at least on par with Phaedra, if not even a little better depending on my mood. I'm not entirely sure how high school me ended up finding this album forgettable, because it very much wasn't for me in present day. Though I think I might have a theory as to how that happened. See, before re-listening to this album for the first time in, like, a decade, I noticed that my iPod had accidentally sequenced the tracks out of order. Thanks to the way some of the track info is inputted inconsistently from track to track, iTunes moved Thru Metamorphic Rocks automatically from the closer to the opener, with Force Majeure and Cloudburst Flight following after it. And thinking back on it, that might be the worst possible order to listen to these three tracks in. Thru Metamorphic Rocks is a great track, but it is not built to be an opener. It would feel like it both takes too long to get going while also feeling like you're starting in the middle of something. And Cloudburst Flight, the track that left the least of an impact on me and the one that felt most like an interstitial bridge, would be left as the album closer. easily the track out of the three that is least built to act as a closer. In that particular order, all three tracks would have their impact noticeably reduced. Just a reminder of how much sequencing matters. These three tracks are already in the exact spots they need to be to hit with the greatest impact, and any shifts would actively make the album worse. Especially the particular one that I had accidentally set up iTunes to give me. But whatever, that's basically just a reason as to why this album doesn't have nearly as much nostalgia factor baked into it for me as the surrounding ones. But at least I know better now. It's probably also worth noting that Phil Hartnell from Orbital recently ran on record during an interview earlier this year that he considers this album to be a really effective starting point for anyone who might be looking to get into Tangerine Dream for the first time. Even though it's technically not his favorite is the same as mine, and we'll get to that one another day. And I can definitely see why he might say this is a good starting point. It does definitely have a certain prog rock flavor to it that none of their other projects do in quite the same way, but it also kind of acts as an important turning point in the band's catalog between the more meandering ambient-leaning synth jams of their earlier catalog and the much more accessible, melodic, and perhaps early techno-flavored material that would follow. Again, I guess if you're ride or die for like that early period TD stuff and don't like any of this rock influence coming in to dirty up your pristine ambient subspaces, then sure, I guess I could see this being a miss for those people. And again, there are other projects in their catalog that I personally hold a lot closer to me. This is yet another TD album where I like the first half a fair bit more than the second half, and that will put it below something like Stratosphere, which I like all the parts of equally. But boy was I kicking myself for sleeping on this one anyway. At this point I really can't say there's any excuse for people to not at least give this one a try, and I can pretty safely put it among their best work, as most people seem to. I'm overall feeling a solid 8 out of 10 on this. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters, they're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.